One of the reasons I love speaking to, especially American political commentators, is I have this philosophy that the sports field is like your life, right? So you're always
Yeah.
on the sports field somewhere. Yet, no matter what sport you're playing, I always reference rugby because I'm from New Zealand, but whether it's American football, often when you're on the field, you can't see the game as clearly as those people who are in the stands. You can't see if the wide receiver's open if you're the quarterback at all times, but the people in the stands can. One of the reasons I love talking to Americans about politics is I consider that some of us, I'm not saying I'm not biased in this conversation, but some of us are sitting in the stands looking down at America and sometimes going, what is all this about? This doesn't seem to make sense. And let me give you an example. The classic is the American right talking about government with a light touch, or the other way it's often said is small government. Now, I think that's a red herring because I don't think big government is good, and I don't think small government is good. I think good government is good. And sometimes, let's say in the time of a pandemic, perhaps big government is the best way to solve the immediacy of what's going on. And sometimes, perhaps in layered bureaucracies that don't need to be there with all that middle management, small government is good. And I wonder sometimes, and this maybe comes back to that tribalism question, we get lost in these conversations with these labels, and rather than go, I'm for small government, why don't we start saying I'm for good government? And sometimes good government needs a lot of resource put into it. Sometimes it has too much resource put into it. But when we pull up those stakes and make our place in that camp, we sometimes get lost having to be tribal rather than make a decent argument, for example.
So it's an interesting question. Peter Thiel, who you probably know, he's the tech billionaire who co-founded PayPal with
He's
Elon
got
Musk.
a house in New Zealand, yeah.
And he's got the house in New Zealand,
Yeah.
right? And I think he has citizenship in New Zealand. He once said to me that if any of it worked, I wouldn't be a libertarian. And I thought that that was a pretty interesting way of putting it. Now, here's a guy who's a billionaire, right? This guy can afford to do whatever he wants. He can talk to any politician within 5 minutes and the rest of it. And I thought there was a certain flippancy to the comment, like if any of it worked, I wouldn't be a libertarian. So when you say good government, now of course I'm with you on that. But what I think is that fundamentally you need a smaller government. So when you said, well, in a time of pandemic, we need big government, I'm actually not sure I agree with you on that premise. So what we're finding right now in the United States is that actually our system is working quite well, I should say, because first off, we thought we were going to get huge numbers. We're getting much less numbers. People have socially distanced. The economy is seriously struggling. But what's happening right now is that the states, each individual state, and this is in many ways a very unique American idea of federalism.
Yeah.
Each individual state is opening up on its own. So I would want things always to be as local as possible. So of course, do I want good government? Yes, I want Texas to make the right decisions for Texas. That's going to be very different than what New York needs or what California needs or elsewhere. So I think the spirit of what you're saying, I agree with, but I think in a functional sense, do we all want good government? Yeah, we want good government. I actually think the only way to get good government is to shrink government. The monster has become so big and such a sucking money machine at all times that the only way to make it good is to slim it. And how do you slim it? You give it less money.
Well, let's give you an example, a concrete example of why I don't. It's not that I disagree with you, because on some issues I'd say smaller is fine, but let's get away from the current, headlines and the current bullet points that
Sure.
political people, and let's look at when and this isn't notes I've got. This is just going off the dome now. Is
Yep.
the smaller government equals fewer people inspecting oil rigs, leading to one of the reasons that was blamed for what happened in the Gulf of Mexico all those years ago, well, a decade or so ago. And smaller government means less inspectors in those areas. Smaller government meaning fewer restrictions around companies that can pollute our natural areas. I don't think the statement always smaller is better is backed up with, as you talk about in your book, facts rather than emotions.
Well, you're talking about specific
Yes.
regulations related to the environment. As a general rule, I sense we just don't see eye to eye on this, which is totally fine, by the
Okay.
way. Yeah, I am for, generally speaking, cutting back regulation. Even in time of Corona right now, one of the things we've been doing is cutting back some of the red tape related to what we can do medically, so that we can get some new technologies out, so we can get some new medicines out, go to trial faster than keeping everything in the lab and the rest of it. And it's like, yeah, we suddenly need stuff. So what are we doing? We're getting rid of regulation. Now, that's not to say that there shouldn't be any regulation. But I don't know that that's exactly a big government or small government thing. There's probably much better ways to do regulation than we had, or than we have. But if you're asking me, well, should offshore oil rigs be allowed to do absolutely whatever they want, so they can penny pinch every which way to maximize profits at the expense of the environment, and at the expense, by the way, of national security and all sorts of stuff? Well, no, I am for some regulation related to that. The question is really, I think, is regulation done properly? I'm not sure that the answer to that is yes all the time.
But
Well, no, I'm sure the answer isn't yes all the time.
But that comes back to the good government. Regulation done
So
correctly.
that's where we're sort of having, it's in a weird way we are agreeing on this, that yes, the goal ultimately is good government. I think the only way to get to good government is you have to strip so much of it away that it has to operate more efficiently. That would be something like, right now I have a small business, and we've been able to survive Corona because I've made sure that all along I didn't have debt. We had low overhead.
Yep.
I did the things responsibly, so that when we came to a time of crisis like we're in right now, I made sure that I was going to be able to pay my guys and the rest of it. So we're doing okay right now. That's how I'd prefer the government operate, rather than be some sort of bloated thing. And then suddenly in a time of crisis, we're like, we really need you. And it's sort of like this giant monster that can't quite coordinate. So the good and small thing, we could probably keep going with it and whittle it into something, really interesting there.
Yeah, I guess I think about the current situation in America, and speaking from the outside looking in, I don't know how anyone can think that the current outcome with coronavirus is a good thing. I was looking at the numbers last night. There's no flattening of the curve, as that classic saying is going on at the moment. There's no drop off of active cases. One of the things that I've seen in countries like New Zealand, who for very different reasons from America have had a very good response to this, is that the number of active cases have been going down. For America to have less than 5% of the world's population, but between 25 and 40% of the cases, deaths, and active cases, it does. And look, and being fair, Africa hasn't been included yet. I'm not saying it's going to stay like that, but I'm not sure how anyone can look at the current stats around what's happening in the American coronavirus. And I'm not saying you've done this, but just in general, and sort of be happy with the situation right now and be comfortable for like full reopening and thinking that it's going to then get better. I think with the reopening, my opinion, which I hope I'm wrong 100%, is that America hasn't seen the worst of it yet, especially if they move towards reopening too soon.
Well, you might be right about that. That's the question that everyone's trying to face, is how long do we stay in lockdown, and what is each individual state? I haven't heard anyone say, oh, let's do a full reopen tomorrow and let's just flip the switch and do it. I haven't heard anyone say that. What I've heard people say is more in line with what's happening in Texas right now, which is they're having a partial reopen. They're going to open up restaurants and open up stores and public places, but less people will be able to go in. I think they're going to still encourage social distancing. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it'll be on up to individual people whether they're wearing masks or not. I think this is sort of the messiness of a free society, is you want to allow people to be free, and you have to weigh that against, in this case, public health. But there's the famous phrase, or the famous saying, those who would give up liberty for security deserve neither. And I think there's some element of that playing it out. There will never be a point when we can open up because there's zero risk. There's always going to be some level of risk. And the best that you can hope for, I think, is that your local elected officials, wherever you are, have looked at the numbers and can give you mature answers to things. So I'll give you just one interesting example on this.
Sure.
In California, you may have seen in the last couple of days, we've closed down the beaches here completely. Now, instead of explaining to us why they did it or why it was necessary or where the numbers are, they didn't really do that. Instead, they just said the beaches are closed, that's it. Now, what would have been a mature response, and I think more in line with some of the things that you're talking about, is they should have said to us, look, we can't, it's beautiful out right now. We know you all want to go to the beaches. You can't go to the beaches at the numbers you normally would. So what we're going to do is we're going to do it at a third capacity. You have to make or a half capacity, whatever it is. You have to make sure that when you park your car has to be one spot away from the closest. There has to be an open spot between you and the next car. We're going to set lines on the beach with tape or whatever that, groups of 4 or less can be there. You have to be 6 feet away. Like giving us a sort of robust, honest response to what this is. And I think people would respond to that well. I think when you say to people, yeah, I do. I think when you just say that, maybe that's a uniquely American thing. But I think when you're honest, or at least attempt to be honest with Americans, they'll accept that. But when you just say to them, hey, we're closing the whole thing down, that's when people get annoyed. So I wish we had better communication from our leaders.
I was talking to a New Zealand comedian who lives in upstate New York a few weeks ago on the podcast. And one of the things he said was, could you imagine Americans being told what to do and following the instructions? So I say really it's based on, because you also talk freedom, individual rights, individual liberty. But now on the other side of that, you're saying, stay in these queues, park your car here and stay in these things. Those seem to be contradictory to one another. And I did think as you were speaking, and I am placing my tongue firmly in my cheek here, setting up that system sounds very big government to me. Lines on the beach, all that kind of stuff. That sounds like very, very Orwellian big government to me. So, and that's when I kind of go. That's when I kind of go. Yeah. It feels sometimes like the picking and choosing is a little bit. And I'm not saying you're showing hypocrisy, but the ideas or the ideologies of it's like when when a company in America goes, market rates, the consumer decides, we rise and fall based on that. And then when there's a GFC or a pandemic, they put the hand out to the government and they say, give me a subsidy. They kind of want to have their foot in both camps.
So I'm more with you on that one in terms of I'm more with you on that in terms of how we do bailouts and things like that, right? We had banks that were too big to fail. And what did we do? We made them bigger. So I'm with you on the secondary part. But the other part, as far as big government, I would say big government is when the government announces something and then you have no way to combat it. So when the government just says the beaches are closed, that's it. I don't view telling us that we have to have some regulations, which is what you're calling for, around how we behave.
Yeah.
I don't view that as big government. If anything, what I laid out there, if you do some distancing and things like that, that's what I would view as, I think, what you called before good government. That good government would level with us in an honest way. That's not to say that, look, you need government to do it. This is where I'm saying I'm not a Mad Max, no government, Fury Road, let's figure it out guy. I would want good government to do limited controls if absolutely necessary.